mutant pigs, Nazi hunters, and an alternate universe. We're not talking about bad Captain America fan fiction. This is Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is a 2018 animated superhero film. It was directed by Bob Persichetti, Peter Ramsey, and Rodney Rothman. It was written for the screen by Phil Lord and Rodney Rothman. And of course, Stan Lee and Steve Ditko's story beats and legacy is all interwoven into this movie. I'm not even going to bother trying to name the cast because there are so many star-studded actors in here, it's pretty insane. And I think it's kind of fun to watch an animated movie and try to figure out who the voices are, so I'm going to let you guys do that. So Miles Morales is the new Spider-Man. Not only is he dealing with a new school and new friends, he has family issues and a lot more that he's dealing with. And to make things even more complicated for him, he has to deal with 5 other Spider-Men that have come to this reality to fight a villain that jeopardizes all of their worlds. So as you guys know, when I talk about movies, I talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, then I give you my score. This movie has absolutely nothing that is ugly about it, so I'm only going to talk about the good and the bad. And with that being said, let's start with the good. Straight out the gate, this movie completely shrugs off the traditional origin story that we're so used to seeing in all of these Marvel and DC films. The filmmakers treat us with respect because they know we are well aware of Spider-Man's origins and all the stuff that makes him who he is. So they don't try to cram it down your throat. As a matter of fact, they make it a strength and they go about it in a very different way for all the different Spider-Men. And not only does it do things differently and take into account the fact that you've seen the other Spider-Man movies, it pokes fun at those Spider-Man movies. One of the funniest jokes in the film makes fun of something that happened in Spider-Man 3. I don't want to spoil it, but when you guys see it, you'll know it right away. And not only does it touch on the previous films, it also goes into the comic books, the toys, even some of the licensed products that we've seen over the last few decades. And I think that's pretty cool. Not only do all of the Spideys have a very unique personality from one another, they also have these little touches in their animations and in the way that they're drawn that separate them from one another. And even though they do have different animation styles and they have different looks about them, when they are all on the screen together, they all blend perfectly. And that really speaks to the planning and execution of the filmmakers and the animators, everybody involved in this production. And all of the actors behind the characters really nail their roles. There's some really great voice acting in this movie that gives it so much more personality than it would have if it was just average voice acting. But the main focus of this movie is Miles Morales' Spider-Man. And that's a good thing because Miles Morales is super likable. He's very relatable because he has all of these very human, normal things going on with him. And Miles has this really great balance of angst and rebelliousness and likability and being really kind to his friends and family. I think he's a really good person and that comes through in his character. One of the things that this film does really well is show the passage of time in unique ways. Whether it be this different montages like the one in the beginning that shows him at school, or a few others. Pretty much everything about the execution of this film is done differently than any other Spider-Man or any other superhero comic book movie that you've seen. Time out real quick. When I was recording this episode, I had some issues with the audio. The microphone cable popped out of the camera and I didn't notice it. So I'm about to resume with my previous recording, so you're going to see that I have a little less hair on my head and a little more hair on my face. So here it goes. For the most part, the movie has a pretty amazing soundtrack and it weaves it into the film so damn well. And while I do love the Post Malone song that they used in the movie like 3 or 4 times, I really love the song they used in the subway while Miles was doing the graffiti. I thought that was super dope, especially the fact that they used Black Sheep, The Choice Is Yours, which is one of the greatest hip-hop songs ever made, period. And you can at me on that shit. And I love the fact that Miles Morales is a graffiti writer, and they actually get a lot of the details about graffiti writers down. You know, he's got his black moleskin sketchbook, and even the way that he puts his layers down on his piece that he's throwing up in the subway is pretty accurate. In the last 5 years or so, I did a ton of short documentaries and music videos and stuff like that about graffiti writers, so when I was seeing that and seeing how authentic it was, I was pretty impressed. There are so many comic book movies that I've watched that tried to give you that comic book feel, and they never really quite succeeded at it. And you guys know what I'm talking about. Stuff like Ang Lee's Incredible Hulk or James Gunn's Super. They throw a couple like little comic book panel things in there, or the stuff that comes up when you punch, it says bam or pow or whatever. But it didn't really feel like it belonged in the film or with that story. And in this one, they not only do the comic book panels justice, but they also use cross-hatching and with the CMYK print dots, all that kind of stuff, and I think it's really impressive. And I know I keep saying things are impressive in this movie, but that's because they are. It's just an impressively done film, and it's so detail-oriented. I can't even imagine the time it took to animate this stuff and just to create the art for it. Not only does it make the movie look super dope and give you that comic book feel, but it also harkens back to all of the Spidey books that it's based off of. One of the things I've always loved about Spider-Man since I was a kid, and remember I'm 42, so I've been a fan of Spider-Man for a long time, is that ongoing monologue that he has. He's always talking to himself, he's always thinking out loud. You know, while he's fighting people, he's talking smack, he's always talking. And none of the Spider-Man movies before this have really gotten that right. But in this one, they nailed it. I think it's the best use of Spidey's monologue that's ever been done on film. And this movie does a lot of things you don't expect. It's not a predictable movie, which I enjoyed. A lot of the actions that the characters make and a lot of the things that the heroes do are unexpected. I really enjoyed all of the little jokes and the nice touches and the details that they added to the film that give it a nice sense of humor, but it doesn't feel over the top. It reminded me of like The Simpsons and Family Guy at their peak, where you'd have these little things that happen in the background, or, you know, some line that's kind of a throwaway line that somebody says, but it's actually really funny. It's very similar to that. And it's pretty great to have an interracial hero. There's not enough of those. There's not enough minority heroes on the big screen right now. They've always been pretty well represented in the books, but it definitely needs to happen more on the big screen and on television shows. But I like how they presented his ethnic roots. You know, he speaks English with his dad, he speaks Spanish with his mom, which is a normal thing, you know, in interracial families, especially if, you know, one person's a predominantly English speaker and somebody else speaks something else. So it's done really well. It's not over the top. It's not in your face. It's very natural. One of the things that struck me about this movie is how much heart it has. It has way more heart than most actual, like, live action drama movies do. And you wouldn't think that because, you know, it's a Spider-Man animated film. But it does do it a lot with some unexpected characters, and it does it well. I really love the effect that happens when the dimensions start to collide, you know, that whole interdimensional blending, all of the colors and the shapes and everything else. And the fact that they're actually weaving in pieces of art styles from the books, like Ditko's dots and stuff like that. While most films have tried to make any kind of dimensional blending almost like a Gaussian blur kind of thing, this one puts it all up in your face. It affects the characters, it affects the objects, it affects the city. It just looks amazing, and it adds so much color and vibrancy and life to the film. It's all just blended together so seamlessly. Even though some things look completely different than one another, they've made it all come together in such a cohesive nature that it's not distracting, it actually complements the entire art style and the animation and everything else. And that goes for the actual mediums of the animation too. The 2D and the 3D coming together is so seamless, and man, it just knocks your socks off. Like the big final battle with the villain and the different Spider-Man and everything else. There's so much going on. It's like if you took Doctor Strange scene where they're fighting and the buildings are shifting, and you multiplied that by 10, and it never feels confusing. It's always cohesive, it's always beautiful. You can keep track of the story and the actions. Like the geography of that scene is so good. I mean, that's what I'm saying. They blend everything so well. So even when you have 2D and 3D together, it just looks great. And while so many comic book movies fall victim to tropes that you've seen in other comic book movies and books and on TV shows, this movie is one of those that takes those tropes and flips them on their head and makes them an asset. It kind of like plays off of them, and it gives you a wink and lets you know they know what they're doing with it. And that's always nice. It's almost like a fourth wall break. And I love how they brought together the different storylines, the suits, the gear, the toys, you know, all of that stuff is referenced and it's all put into the movie. I never felt like Spider-Man needs a motorcycle or a car or a plane. You see those different things in the background that you've, you know, had since you were a kid and stuff that you played with. And I think that was a nice touch. I really like Miles Morales' story arc. I love that he's a fish out of water and he's basically learning how to be Spider-Man on the go. You know, all this responsibility gets thrown on his shoulders, you know, great power, great responsibility and all that stuff. And he accepts it and he tries to do his best. And I think that's all anybody can do with anything in life. And I think that's a big part of the message of the film. I love Marissa Tomei's portrayal of Aunt May in the new Spider-Man films, but the Aunt May in this film was really cool. She was really unique. to all of the other Spider-Man films. Because she's super cool, she's tough, she's smart, she knows about the whole Spider-Man thing and how it works, and it doesn't surprise her. She's on board with it, she's basically part of the team. But again, they keep it kind of subtle, it's not in your face and annoying. There's even a really great Stan Lee cameo in the movie, and it speaks to his character, what he thought of it. So it's more than just a cameo. It also speaks to his life and what he thought about Spider-Man and everything, and I think that's awesome. And at the end, there is a tribute to Stan Lee and Steve Ditko. While everybody's talking about the soundtrack, the actual music from the original score is pretty damn great. And even if they had done the whole movie with just that original score, I would have been happy with it. It's that good. I think it's one of the better scores in any Marvel film. And I think the movie overall, it's great for all ages. Grown-ups can watch it and dig it. Little tiny kids can watch it and just feel inspired and think that they one day can be a superhero, that they can make a difference. And I think that's the main message of the film is no matter who you are, you know, where you're from, what you've done, you can be something greater and you can help people. You can make a difference and, you know, you can overcome insurmountable odds if you really just keep trying. And I think that's true, and I love that there's such a positive message in this film because so many superhero movies have like this dark edge to them. And I like that, but I also like a little bit of positivity once in a while, and this movie nails that. It's a simple, fun, breezy story that has a lot of layers, and it makes its 2-hour runtime feel like a lot less, and I think that's kick-ass. And I'm not always a fan of the different post-credit scenes that you get in Marvel movies. I think the post-credit scene in this one, I think it's one of the best ever in any Marvel movie, hands down. If you love Spider-Man and you love the different iterations that there have been of the character over the years, you're going to have a pleasant surprise. So definitely watch that end credit scene. You're going to crack up. So that's what I have to say about the good of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Now let's talk about the bad. There's nothing really bad about this film at all. These are all just little tweaks that I think could have really put the movie over the top. Peter Parker's Spider-Man is older and he's out of shape, but during the movie he goes from skinny to fat depending on the scene, especially like the action scenes. You don't see that tummy that he's got. It's basically like in Endgame, you know, you've got Fat Thor who's kind of disheveled and a schlub the whole movie, and then all of a sudden when he put on the Thor costume, he was that ripped, you know, jacked, badass Thor again. They don't do that. When he puts on the costume, he's basically Fat Thor with the costume, and that's pretty great. It's funny. So Into the Spider-Verse, Peter Parker's corpulent nature kind of shifts back and forth depending on the scene, which is a little weird. I love all of the animation styles in this movie and how different characters have different looks and details and stuff. There was only one character's animations that kind of annoyed me a little bit, and that was Doc Ock's arms. There were just certain times where they looked really weird, and I think it's because they were more of a 3D effect, and it looked like almost like those things that come out of Donnie Darko's chest when he's seeing into the future, but not nearly as cool. They just looked kind of off. There's a pretty big reveal that happens about midway through the movie. It's a twist that you're supposed to not see coming, but the problem is they kind of indicate what's going to happen before it does. You know, the foreshadowing is a little too obvious, especially for anybody who's savvy when it comes to movies, comics, games, TV. You're going to know it, you're going to see it before it happens, and it's going to kind of take that surprise away a little bit. It's still cool, it's still a good reveal, it still works, but it doesn't hit you like, wow, I didn't see that coming, that was crazy. While I do love a lot of the soundtrack and the way that they weave it into the movie almost seamlessly, there are a few songs on the soundtrack that are straight garbage. And you guys know what I'm talking about, like the mumble rap stuff and like the really mainstream stuff. And it's not just that those songs are bad, they also use them at weird times in the film, and it kind of throws off the vibe of the scene and it takes you out of the movie a bit. This isn't a spoiler, obviously you guys know this, but all these other Spider-Man from all the different Spider-Verses come into Miles Morales' reality. And the thing is, they all come at once during this one event. But one of the Spideys gets brought into his universe like a week early, and it doesn't really fit with the story, and it doesn't really make sense with the rules that the film set up. The only reason they did it was purely to have that character in the film earlier on so you get more attached to them, and so Miles can get more attached to them. And that's it for the bad. Like I said, these are all just minor gripes that kind of brought the film down a little bit, but not very much. Honestly, this is the best Spider-Man film ever made. This one stays the truest to the character out of any single Spider-Man film that's been made since the early 2000s with Sam Raimi's original. They all have pros and cons and all that stuff, but this one, it's just all there, man. Like all the notes that you want from Spider-Man's story, from his emotional state, the things that he deals with. Spider-Man Homecoming is great, and I love the new Spidey in and out of costume. I think he's fantastic. I think he's the best live-action Spider-Man so far. Easy. But between Miles Morales and old Peter Parker and all that stuff in this movie, it's definitely the most Spider-Man film. That being said, what is my score? Drum roll, please. 9 out of 10.